the Yu-Gi-Oh! Meta Counter Guide. Big dog, not only have I played this Infinite Forbidden format extensively, I've also talked to some of the top players of the game, and this is what they have to say to be able to beat the best decks. So of course I gotta say it, shout out to my mans Jib and Ruben. Alongside of me in chat, we're gonna be giving you the information, all of the information you know to be able to dominate these decks. Let's go ahead and jump on in. What's going on with ya, big dog? And it is an amazing day for Yu-Gi-Oh! I hope that's your day phenomenal. But if it isn't, don't let what happened at the beginning of your day ruin the rest of your day. The strongest decks in Yu-Gi-Oh! Are a little overwhelming at times. And whether you're playing one of the best decks yourself or you're playing against one of these particular decks, it is very important that you know which cards are effective and where they are effective at, because you don't want to get clapped. I'm going to be breaking this video down into multiple different sections so you can know exactly where is everything. The only thing that I ask for you guys, if you want to support, is just let me know down below in the comment section what deck are you using and what deck do you have the biggest problem with this format. Let's go ahead and start off with the elephant in the room, Snake Eyes Fiendsmith. So Fiendsmith Snake Eyes is a really powerful combo deck that is built on one card combos. Just one Snake Eyes Ash can end on monsters like IP Masquerena, Flame Beurge, and an Appaloosa Bull of the Goddess, meaning that not only can they get resources back, they can go into some really deadly cards and stop some of your most powerful effects. And since all of this was done with one card, you better believe that they have a ton of other cards to be able to stop you from playing the game. The problem with this is now the Fiendsmith engine makes the deck a lot more resilient. Before we knew if you use multiple effect negation cards like Infinite Impermanence and Effect Veiler on cards like Yubel Star and Snake Eyes Ash, it would effectively end their turn. Now the deck can still go full combo, which is a little annoying. And if you guys want to know how the deck can still play through those particular situations, I just so happen to have made a video detailing everything you need to know about playing around those particular cards. And while I am still going to be giving you general advice about how to beat this deck, I want to point out that Ruben said something really important that should change how you think about dealing with these decks. When you have multiple hand traps, you want to use these cards on the engines of the deck to prevent them from having the best of both worlds. Being able to use these cards in key choke points against the Snake Eyes engine and the Fiendsmith engine is incredibly important, but above everything else, it really depends on what deck you're playing and the hand that you have. Either that, or now if you have 3 points of interaction, you can end their turn. It's just not likely. Their goal is to take 15 minutes or more in main phase 1. I think one of the biggest things to talk about with Snake Eyes Fiendsmith is where should you use your irrigation cards knowing that they can probably still combo if you hit the wrong things. And the answer to that is fairly simple. In general, I think regardless of what your opponent does, it is still always the best bet to be able to use effect negation cards like Infinite Impermanence and Effect Veiler on your opponent's normal summon of Snake Eyes Ash, or if they normal summon Snake Eyes Puppet. And the reason why we stop this is because this is the bread and butter of the Snake Eyes engine. It puts your opponent on have the extension card or put them in a really bad spot. Now, if your opponent does summon Yubel Star, this is where that decision tree that Ruben was talking about gets them. Stopping the Yubel Star with another effect negation card means that Snake Eyes still goes Snake Eyes full combo. But they have to use their Fiendsmith cards to be able to do this. And that can be considered a huge win if your deck is used to being able to combat the Snake Eyes full board. But if you're actually okay with your opponent doing Fiendsmith, or you're daring your opponent to have a third extension card, specifically Bonfire, then we actually hold that second effect negation until our opponent summons Snake Eyes Oak. This particular method shuts your opponent entirely out of their Snake Eyes combo unless they have a card like Bonfire or 1-for-1. And to be honest, you're playing the numbers game. The odds of your opponent having all three of those extension pieces are fairly low, but I will say it does happen. If you come across a situation when your opponent is desperate enough to summon Fiendsmith Sequentia and doesn't have another way to get a monster on the field, using an effect negation on that particular monster is also incredibly important. As for Ash Blossom and Joy Spring, it's pretty much the same as the effect negations. You can use it on the effect of Requiem to summon from the deck, but that's most effective if your opponent didn't start off with Engraver of the Fiendsmith to get into their Fiendsmith engine. Other than that, using it directly on the Engraver or the Fiendsmith Tract are also really good options. If you want to deal with the Snake Eyes engine, I wouldn't use the effect on Original or Snake Eyes Ash. I would actually use it on the effect of Snake Eyes Oak to summon from the deck. Typical Snake Eyes players will use Ash to summon Oak, Oak to summon a body, and then Oak effect to summon out Flame Beurge. That's where you want to stop it. For your DD Crow and Bestial-like cards, using them on Engraver of the Fiendsmith is crazy good. But one of the best things about going against this deck is Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. This card can be used offensively to be able to stop your opponent from summoning Snake Eyes via Velstar. Use it if you know your opponent needs that extension piece, but also could be held on into your turn. It stops the Field Spell in Snake Eyes Temple. It also stops Appaloosa Bull of the Goddess, SP Little Knight to be able to banish itself in another monster, and IP Masquerena. I made a hand trap tier list last week, which is still fairly accurate. Coolly enough, the information on that tier list is still 90% correct. It's just that I would say Ghost Ogre will move up to the solid choice Yu-Gi-Oh card, and DD Crow and the Bestials are pretty much in the same tier. And how exactly will we be breaking Fiendsmith Snake Eyes board? Well, it's actually kind of crazy. Fiendsmith Snake Eyes is incredibly weak to good board breakers. If they don't have a board with Fiendsmith Desiree, then they're actually cooked by a triple tactics talent, Change of Heart, or Mind Control. Cards like Dark Ruler No More and Forbidden Droplet are incredibly effective because this particular deck doesn't have a way to play around those cards. It simply just gets its board negated and allow you to do whatever. Now, obviously, you still have to deal with hand traps and some of their other cards that they may have face down, but at least you can get rid of their main threat. Now, some good side deck cards to help you cook against the Snake Eyes Fiendsmith. Cards like Fantastical Dragon, Phantasme, and Mole Chummy actually put you in a position to solve that effect negation problem. Typically, 2 negations isn't enough to be able to stop Fiendsmith Snake Eyes, but if you use these cards, you have a higher chance of being able to see more interruptions, and 3 is definitely more than enough to shut them down. Different Dimension Ground is crazy good at being able to essentially skip their turn, and Robbery of the Warlords is pretty good at preventing them from making a board, but also can be really good from breaking their board if they don't have any way to stop it. And the last thing I want to say about going into Game 2 and Game 3 is that oftentimes the Snake Eyes Fiendsmith player will side a Floodgate card to be able to send with Beatrice. If you are aware of this situation, it is almost paramount to ignore everything else that I said and stop Beatrice at all costs if the Floodgate is going to cook you. Or hear me out, quick effect scoop, they can't beat you and reduce your life points to 0. Tenpai is another one of the most powerful decks in the entire Yu-Gi-Oh card game. This deck is built on going second and winning in that turn. It's especially scary considering that their powerful field spell protects all of their Tenpai Dragon monsters, and their new monster in Genroku makes the deck a lot more consistent. But just like anything else, there's some problems with this deck that we can exploit. Most Tenpai Dragon deck lists run roughly around 18 ways to get into their 1-card starter, but unfortunately, they don't play enough extenders. So if you are able to use cards like Effect Veiler on Tenpai Dragon Hydra, you probably should every single time. Infinite Impermanence is slightly different because you're going to be judging on what your opponent wants to do. You could use Infinite Impermanence on the Hydra immediately if you have a way to stop your opponent's extenders, but if your opponent only has a 1 monster like Tenpai Dragon Tundra and they're attacking with it, using cards like Infinite Impermanence or Forbidden Droplet on that monster on attack declaration prevents it from activating its effect, summoning another monster, and a lot of times can force them to lose their monster. For Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, there's also another decision tree. If you notice your opponent is low on resources, or if you've already stopped a card like Sengen Kaimen, using this card to stop Genroku is phenomenal. It also should be noted that if your opponent has multiple Tenpai Dragon monsters, including Genroku on the field, then you're not going to be able to Ash Blossom Sengen Kaimen if they Synchro Summon into Transcendent Dragon before entering their battle phase. And yes, using an effect negation to stop Transcendent Dragon before they enter battle phase, if they don't have the field spell, is really good. Statistically, Tenpai Dragon does not have the resources to always have that second extender. Sometimes you will be dead in the water, but you have to accept that when going against this deck. When siding against Tenpai Dragon, Skill Drain is a phenomenal card as it does really shut down their game. There's also Dragon Capture Jar to switch all of the monsters to Yo! Imagine siding Dragon Capture Jar! Outside of that, there isn't a ton of cards that are really good against this deck. I actually think that Dimensional Barrier is okay. It's mainly because Tenpai Dragon has access to links, but if you are playing Dimensional Barrier, I strongly suggest that you use it in the battle phase. The reason why we do this is because we avoid getting Link OTK'd, but if they make Transcendent Dragon, you're cooked. The only way around this is if they use Genroku during that turn. That will prevent them from link summoning into the OTK. If you guys were playing the Black Goat Laughs, a common thing for players to do was to use it on Tenpai Dragon Tundra, but when Genroku now existing, they have access to another tuner. So what you do is you call Biden Dragon and you make sure that he doesn't run for re-election again. Heat Wave if they're forced to go first. Let's talk about that. If you're playing against a Tenpai Dragon player, you would probably think that their win condition is to win the game going second. So oftentimes you would tell them to go first. Not a smart idea. The reason why I say that is because Tenpai Dragon's genuine goal is to not die on any given turn. Because the deck can one-shot you at any given time, forcing it to go first may not be the best idea. If you are playing one of the better decks in the game, you still want Tenpai Dragon to go second and play through your entire board. A lot of times, if you're side decking, you side deck some cards that are amazing going first, and you go first and you make your full board. Now, the last strategy is Yubel, which is incredibly hard to deal with. The reason why Yubel is so good is because there are times where hand traps feel completely useless against this deck. And at its highest point, if you allow them to just play freely, they can make Varudras, Appaloosa Bowl of the Goddess, they make Phantom of Yubel, they have Abominable Underchain and Appaloosa, as well as the Unchained Soul of Rage in the graveyard. Oh, and the Fiendsmith Deseret. So our approach on beating Yubel with hand traps is almost as similar to Snake Eyes. You're gonna have to decide on which particular engine you want to stop, whether it's the Fiendsmiths or the Yubel. Typically, you want to stop Yubel, and it's all incredibly dependent on their play log. What I've seen a lot of people do is if you have a card like Infinite Impermanence or Effect Veiler, they immediately use it on the Samsara Lotus. Unfortunately, Samsara Lotus does tribute itself for cost, so if they can bring this card back to the side of the field, they can use this effect again. But what I found incredibly effective is to wait until they use Samsara Lotus's effect to summon Spirit of Yubel if it's their opening play, and then use those cards on that particular monster. Now, unfortunately, this does allow them to be able to make Phantom Yubel, but to be honest with you, 9 times out of 10, they probably were going to make it anyways. And now that I'm speaking about Phantom Yubel, I have some wisdom that came from both Ruben and Jib about dealing with the Yubel matchup. The first one comes from Jib. Just win the dice roll. He literally said that's how you beat the deck. You just can't lose the dice roll. Skill issue. But on a more serious note, if you can use your hand traps to trade with their once per turn effects, you probably should. And the reason why is because Yubel does play a ton of brick cards. A standard Yubel deck plays 8 bricks, giving them roughly a 70% chance of having at least one in their hand. Oftentimes, if your opponent starts off with Nightmare Pain, Nightmare Throne, or Samsara Lotus effect, Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring should be used on those immediately. And sometimes you're going to have to shotgun effects depending on the situation. Keep in mind this deck can summon Phantom of Yubel at any given time, and as a skilled Yubel player, they'll be looking to summon it as fast as possible. So any given time, if you notice your opponent is using an effect that could put them in a position to have a Yubel monster and a 0/0, you probably want to stop that particular situation if you're using a monster effect. This means that pretty much the bestial monsters need to be used if your opponent starts off with Nightmare Throne to destroy Spirit of Yubel, because that not only does put a Yubel monster on the field, it puts Spirit of Yubel in the graveyard, which is a 0/0 monster. Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit is pretty good against the deck, and it's especially good against Nightmare Throne. A lot of times, Yubel players only play one copy of that card, so if you can Ghost Ogre that, you're smooth sailing. Using this card offensively on Nightmare Throne's effect to be able to summon a Yubel out is still really good too. If you're summoning monsters, you should probably summon them in defense if your opponent has Nightmare Pain and a Yubel face on the field. Because if you don't, you're going to have to go to battle, you're going to have to attack into the Yubel, and you're going to have to take a lot of damage. Cards like Mind Control, Change Your Heart, Triple Tactics Talent, and Snatch Steal are amazing against the deck, especially if you can simplify what the deck has on the board. And an incredible card against Yubel is Power Filter. This card completely shuts the entire deck down. There's also King Tiger Wangu too. Those cards in combination with one another make sure that the deck does not go any further than what it is. Now, the last strategy I want to squeeze in there is dealing with Gimmick Puppet. Gimmick Puppet is an insanely powerful Yu-Gi-Oh deck that's built on one thing and one thing only: FTKing you. It means that if this deck goes uninterrupted, it can reduce your life points to 0 on the very first turn. It also has a field spell that protects its Gimmick Puppet monsters from your card effects. So we need to know what to do and what to hand trap. To be able to handle Gimmick Puppet, it's actually Quite simple. If your opponent doesn't open up with the field spell, which is very possible, if you can negate Gimmick Puppet, Fiendsmith Machina, negate it every single time. This card gets them into their important rank up spell that they need to be able to FTK you. Also, another thing to note about this deck is that if you have Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, it is best used on Bloody Doll. Bloody Doll allows them to be able to get into their Phantom 6, and this card is a huge part of their combos. Your Bestial monsters can genuinely put in work against their Terror Baby and Bisque Doll. If you want to be able to activate cards in response or target your opponent's monsters with card effects, using a Bestial monster preemptively to stop these cards is really important. But if you have a DD Crow, I would not suggest that you DD Crow these particular cards. You're actually going to use DD Crow on the Argent Chaos Force. DD Crowing the Argent Chaos Force is a huge blow to the deck and a lot of times can stop them from FTKing you. When you're siding against this deck, this strategy absolutely loses to Droll and Lockbird, which is really good. It also can just flat out lose to any deck that can go first and get rid of the field spell before they can gain its protection effects, or strategies that can make Exceed monsters to negate those effects. And if you are genuinely scared of this deck, you can side the Spooky Dogwood. Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood completely obliterates this matchup, but I will say, Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood is pretty much only good against this matchup. I mean, you could side it against Snake Eyes. That's a lot of life points. Another great card against this deck is Dimensional Barrier, seeing that it is all an Exceed strategy. And if you want to know about some more powerful cards that you should be playing, then be sure to check out these other videos explaining what are the best hand traps and the best staples. Until the next one, guys, I'll see you there.